Hi guys and welcome to another video. My name's Mark, I'm an entrepreneur and property investor. In today's video, we have a slightly morbid conversation to have, and that is about my exit strategy when it comes to my property investments, and most of my investments to be honest. And I'm going to tell you right now, my exit strategy for my property investments is death. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means in a minute. And the reason that I've kind of thought about this today, I've just had a letter through from my solicitors. We did our wills and updated those last year, along with some lasting power of attorneys, and I've just been signing those documents off. So I thought it would be a good idea to have a conversation about what my exit strategy with the majority of my property investments is. Obviously, this is prone to being changed depending on what the market does, depending on what happens with the macro and micro economy, and what property investing looks like in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But for me at the moment, I'm certainly intending that my exit strategy for the majority of my properties will be death. And I'm going to talk to you on the whiteboard about what that looks like. So Nick, let's go over to the whiteboard and get into the video. Boom. Guys, welcome to the whiteboard, and as you can see, a bit of a morbid title. Exit strategy is death. I've missed out the strategy word, but exit is death. And I'm going to go through the reasons behind that. And actually, I think this video you're going to find really, really useful, and it might really help with your mindset of what the future looks like for you. And for me, long term, it's always a good idea to have this kind of reminder of what we're doing it for, and what things look like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years time, and what it will affect everybody around you, including your family. One of my big points on here is legacy. So I will talk about that towards the end and how I'm going to structure my properties in order to make sure that my family and my children get to benefit from that. And when they get to benefit from that's the key. And we'll come into that in a minute, I promise. So the first thing I want to talk about is taxes. Now, every time you sell a property, you're going to end up attracting taxes. Because if it's in your personal name, you're going to pay capital gains tax, which at the moment is 28%. And if it's a limited company, you're going to pay 19%, which is your corporation tax. And then you're going to pay a further tax to get the money out of the company. So for me, taxes is the very first reason that my exit strategy is death. Now, there are lots of things that you can do to avoid inheritance tax using things like bare trusts, and there's lots of ways to do that. And I'm not a solicitor and I'm not an accountant, but I would definitely suggest meeting up with somebody who's very knowledgeable about this for the long term and putting in place those sort of policies and procedures once you're on your journey. So for me, taxes is the very first thing that I want to try and minimise. By doing refinancing rather than selling, I avoid all of these taxes, and rather than paying, for example, 28% on the profit, I can refinance at 75% loan to value, which means I only leave 25% in. Now let me give you an example. If you bought a property for 200 grand, it then became worth about £1 million, let's say, I don't know, 30 years later, because we are talking about the long term on this. Certainly for me, I'm hoping that my death is somewhere over there, significantly. You bought the house for 200,000, it's now worth £1 million. If you refinanced it, you could get 750 grand out. If you sold it, you'd have to pay your corporation tax or your capital gains tax, then your income tax or your dividend tax, depending on how it's structured. But ultimately, you'd probably end up with about the same, only you'd continue to hold the asset if you refinanced it. So the very first thing on my list, the very first reason that my exit strategy for my properties is death is taxes. Number two, transaction fees. Now again, I guess this comes down to the fact that why I don't want to be buying and selling all the time. And when I'm making these purchases, again, I'm thinking about the long term and making sure that I want to be holding these properties for a long period of time. Now, I appreciate situations can change and I am not so rigid as to say I'm always going to hold these properties. But at the moment, every investment I'm making is with the intention of holding it until death. So transaction fees play a massive part in that. Every time you transact in the market, people take their fees. So we're talking solicitors, we're talking accountants, we're talking mortgage companies. And these add up, right? Solicitors alone is going to be £1,500 on a purchase, absolute minimum. Then you're going to have to pay for a valuation of probably £400, £500, something like that. You're going to have a mortgage arrangement fee of a couple of thousand. You know, all these things are going to add up, and eventually, I think it's between, stamp duty. I forgot stamp duty. I mean, it's just another tax, but let's say on average, that's going to be 5 to 10,000. It's a huge amount of money, you know? And ultimately, every time you place a transaction in the market, people are going to chip off bits of your money, chip off bits of your wealth. And we refer to this, or I refer to this, as a transaction drag on your wealth creation. So my aim is always to minimize the number of transactions I do within the most effective way for my investing career. Now the next point on my thing is time. And again, this comes down to the transactions, the taxes and time. They all come in together really, because every time you're going to transact, it takes time. So a good example would be buying and selling a property. So if we look at my house in, I don't know, we'll take the one in Corby, for example. That one, I bought it for 116 and I offered in June last year. It took me 9 months to complete the purchase, and I appreciate that's a little bit longer than normally. Normally it would be between 3 and 6, but 9 months to complete. It then took me 3 months to do the work, and then so that's 12 months, a year already. And then if it then took me a further 6 months to sell it, then we'd be talking, 18 months to do one buy and sell. And then I've got to buy another one, which is going to take me another 12 months. So you're talking about, to get a property back in the portfolio, a complete cycle of about 3 years. It's a huge amount of time. Now, you can only do that over my useful life that's left, probably something like, 10 times. So for me, that's not a very effective time way. So for me, that's not a very efficient use of my time to build my portfolio. I'm much better off buying, renovating, refinancing, and then buying again. Or buying, holding, refinancing as the capital appreciates, and then buying again. Either of those would be preferable to having to go through the transaction fees and having to lose all that time each time I wanted to make a move. Now, the final thing on my list is legacy. And the reason that I created a company with some of my co-directors called Legacy. And that's because as investors and as a property investor myself, the next generation are always on our minds. And I've got 3 young children, Josh, Jay and Olivia, who are all under 5 years old at the moment. Now I'm 38 and it's very much on my mind what they're going to get as they grow up and how I'm going to make sure that I can provide for them the best I possibly can. Now, whilst they're under 18, they're living with me, then it's my responsibility to look after them in my household. But once they leave my household, I've got to decide whether it's still my responsibility to look after them or whether I'm going to wait until I die. And a lot of people do take this position of I'm going to wait until I die and then I'm going to pass the money on. And for me, I think that's wrong. I actually think that timing my children's inheritance and access to my wealth is going to be key for their future. So let me switch over the paper and I'll show you what I mean. So I have just had a quick look on Google and I've just found out that I am likely to live until I'm 88 years old when I plugged in my data. That was around my wealth, my health, my age, all those sort of things. And maybe the life expectancy is a bit lower than that at the moment for a male in the UK, increasing capabilities in healthcare over time. Either way, 88 years is how long it is likely to be until I die. Now that's 50 years into the future. So for me, what that means for my children is Josh will be 55 or 56, his birthday very shortly. Jay will be 54 and Olivia will be 51. That for me is far too late for them to be receiving access to the money. For me, I want them to be receiving it much, much earlier. One of the conscious decisions I've made is to make sure that my children always have enough that they can do whatever it is that they choose, but never too much that they can choose to do nothing. So I'm using a limited company structure. At the moment, none of my children have any access to any of the shares, but my intention is over time, they will gain access to the company and they will be able to draw money out of that in the form of dividends. Akin to a trust fund, if you like. It will be in a way that they will be able to get access to it. And there are multiple ways that we can set this up now, and there are multiple ways we can set this up later. Because we've got a bit of time and we don't know what the rules are going to be like in 15 years' time, chances are that I'll leave it for the time being and wait until we get into a position when we can actually make some sensible decisions. But my real aim is that at 21, I want my children to be able to have access to a decent chunk of the money. And at 30, when they start having children, I want them to be able to be really well looked after so that they can concentrate on whatever it is that they want to do. If my children want to be artists and travel around the world, I want them to be able to experience that. If they want to create a business, I want to be able to support them in doing that. I don't want them to give them too much that they can do nothing, because I don't believe the universe ever rewards that kind of behaviour. But I do want to make sure that they have enough money to be able to achieve anything. So for me, that's the real key, and it's a really hard balance. But I would urge everybody to think, do you want to be leaving the money to your children when they're 55, 54 and 51? Because by then you've got grandchildren. I remember reading recently in a book, I think it was called Die With Zero by Bill Perkins, and there was a lady who died in their 90s and she had over 5 million left over. But her daughter had lived her entire life in squalor, raising up her children in a real hard situation. She left all the money to her daughter, but her children and her grandchildren were already elderly by the time they got access to it. A complete waste of resources. So I would be really urging everybody who's watching this to make sure that they're allocating their resources to people at the right time if that is their intention. I think in the same book it says that dying and leaving an inheritance is incredibly selfish because it's just a legal requirement, it's not an act. Giving while you're still alive, now that's selfless because you're actually giving the money. Once you're dead, it has to go somewhere. It's not your choice. It's your choice where it goes, but it has to go somewhere. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. My exit strategy is very much to build my portfolio, to make sure it can provide for me, my family and my children, but I would love to know what yours is. Please put it down in the comments. I reply to every single one. Give this video a like and subscribe. I've really tried to put as much really good information out on this one for you to really get you thinking. But guys, I'll see you again on Friday. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.